great pleasure that I introduce to you Professor Jeffrey Brower, who will be talking about Thomas Aquinas on human personhood and death. So please welcome.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here, and I'm excited to talk to you about the subject matter I have for this lecture today. There's a handout that went around. Can you hear me okay? Is this loud enough? There's a handout that went around. There's a lot of information on there. Don't worry, I won't be covering it all. In particular, the last few pages have some text, which I won't be reading. They're just there as a kind of crutch for me. If things get hard, we'll go to the text. I'll also be putting material up here on the screen in the form of PowerPoint slides. Some of the material will overlap with the handout, but some won't. So here, for example, is an outline of my talk. That's not on the handout. But as you'll notice, maybe you can't see it, but in the lower right-hand corner, I've numbered the slides. If there's something you want to return to later on in the question and answer period, just make a note of the slide and we can return to it. I guess I should have put the numbers up there. Okay, my topic for today is the nature of human personhood and death. And my strategy for addressing it will be to draw on the thought of the 13th century philosopher and theologian, my hero, Thomas Aquinas. There's a nice picture of him. As you may know, Aquinas is one of the most important and original thinkers of the Middle Ages. His contributions to virtually every area of medieval philosophy and theology, and in particular his success at bringing the philosophy of Aristotle into harmony with Christian theology, made him enormously influential during his own lifetime and helped to shape the development of much medieval thought after him. One of the things I'll be trying to convince you of today is that as philosophers, we have a lot to learn from Aquinas about human personhood and death, even though, or maybe precisely because, what he has to say on this topic is so bound up with the details of his specifically Christian theology. In particular, his views about the immortality of the soul, the resurrection of the body, and the doctrine of the incarnation of Christ. In order to clarify my topic, as well as to bring out its practical significance, it will be helpful to get before our minds certain obvious truths, or what I'll call truisms. Here's the first one. As humans, we possess bodies. Indeed, as humans, we possess bodies of a distinctive type. Living bodies, or organisms, where these are bodies composed of such parts as hands, heads, arms, legs, atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems. Here's a second thesis. As persons, we possess minds or souls. This, too, is supposed to be an obvious truth, and I think it is one, at least if we take minds or souls broadly enough to include whatever it is that makes us alive and endows us with the capacity for rational thought and volition. Okay, and here's a third one. As humans, as both humans and persons, or as we might say, as human persons, we are mortal beings, and hence will someday die. Non-human persons, such as God and the angels, are traditionally said to be immortal, and hence naturally incapable of death. In this respect, sadly, we differ from such non-human persons. We're not only capable of dying, we're naturally disposed to die. That's the point of saying we're mortal. And just so you know, I'll be following the tradition here and thinking of death intuitively as the separation of the mind or soul from the body. So there's a few truisms. These truisms raise a host of philosophical issues, and some of the most important or intriguing of them cluster around the following three interrelated groups of questions. Here's the first. What's the nature of our minds or souls and bodies, and how are they related both to each other and to us? This is going to be our first group of questions, and I think it's the most fundamental of all. At least getting clear about this set of questions, or the answers to this set of questions, will be necessary for making progress with respect to our other two, beginning with questions about human nature. How exactly are we to understand our nature as human persons? Are we fundamentally material beings, immaterial beings, or some combination of both? And of course, both of these two sets of questions are relevant to the third set about human death. What happens to us at death? Evidently, we cease to be alive, but does this entail that we cease to exist altogether, or do we somehow survive our death? In the remainder of my talk, I want to explore Aquinas' answers to these three sorts of questions. And I want to do so by comparing his answers with those that have been traditionally given, or with those that have been traditionally given to them by proponents of some other more familiar conceptions of human persons. So this brings us to part 2, traditional conceptions. In the contemporary literature, it's standard to distinguish two main conceptions of human persons, namely materialism and substance dualism, based on the different types of answers they give to that first set of questions, the mind-body questions. Eventually, we'll see that it's worth distinguishing a third possible conception here, one that's not always kept distinct in the literature, but for now, we can begin by focusing on the standard 2, and in particular on the materialism side of things. According to materialism, human persons are wholly material beings. This is truth in advertising. Thus, they can be said to have material parts, arms, legs, cells, tissues, organs, and so on, but no immaterial parts, and certainly no immaterial minds or souls. On certain forms of materialism, human persons are said to lack a mind or soul altogether. But it is, I think, more common to say that they have minds or souls, but only in the way in which things have shapes or colors, namely as properties or characteristics that depend for their existence on the arrangement of their material parts. For our purposes, we can think of materialism about human persons in terms of the 5 claims which I've listed at C on your handout. And they go like this. There's exactly one type of substance required to explain our nature as human persons, according to materialists, namely material substances. Our bodies are material substances. Our minds or souls are properties, and we're identical to our bodies and possess our minds and souls in the way that things possess properties. And of course, it follows from this that we're wholly material beings. For the sake of clarity, we can illustrate this conception pictorially using Aquinas' favorite example of a human being, namely Socrates. So here's Socrates' body. It's a material substance. Here's Socrates' soul. It's a property. And I've put that dotted line around the box to show you that it's not substantial. It's a property. And the relationship between body and soul is roughly that between properties and subjective properties. And of course, Socrates is identical to the body. Okay, so much for materialism. Let's now turn to the second main conception of human persons, substance dualism. Unlike materialists, substance dualists appeal to 2 different types of substance to explain our nature as human persons. One material, the other immaterial. That's why they're called substance dualists. Like materialists, substance dualists identify human bodies with material substances, but unlike them, they identify human minds or souls with immaterial substances rather than properties, and they identify human beings themselves with their minds or souls. For the sake of contrast with materialism, we can think of substance dualism in terms of 5 claims as well, namely those I list at D on the handout. So in here you just get a direct contrast. Instead of one type of substance, there's 2, material and immaterial. Our bodies are material substances, our minds are immaterial substances. We're identical to our minds and possess our bodies by, typically, it's said, exercising causal control over them. And of course, it follows from this conception that we're wholly immaterial beings. Once again, we can illustrate this conception pictorially for the particular case of Socrates. So here we have 2 substances, Socrates' body, which is a material substance, Socrates' soul, which is an immaterial substance. The relation between them now is conceived of along the lines of causal connection, and Socrates is identified with the soul side of things. Now, substance dualism is a conception of human persons that goes back a long way, at least to Plato. Indeed, Aquinas just thinks of this as the Platonic view, or Plato's view. Nowadays, however, it's more common to associate this conception of human persons with Descartes, or refer to it as the Cartesian view, Cartesian dualism. It's worth noting, however, that there is another conception of human persons distinct from both materialism and substance dualism, which is sometimes associated with Descartes. According to this view, which we can refer to as trialism, because it invokes 3 different types of substance, human persons are to be identified not with their minds or with their bodies, but rather with a complex substance composed of each. For the sake of completeness, let's characterize trialism in terms of 5 claims, namely those listed at E. And here you can probably begin to see how the permutations go. Now we've got 3 substances, material, immaterial, complex substances. Our bodies are material substances. Our minds or souls are immaterial substances. We're identical to the complex substance. And for the same reason, we possess both body and minds as parts. And as a result, we're partly material and partly immaterial rather than wholly immaterial. In the case of Socrates, we can illustrate that like this. Now we've got three substances: material substance, an immaterial substance, a complex substance. The relationship between mind and body, or soul and body, is slightly more complicated. It's not exactly property to property possessor or causal connection. Perhaps we can call it substantial union, since the one substance unites with another substance to make a third type of substance. And, of course, the relation here is something like composition or parthood when you put it all together. Okay, so there are the three different conceptions. Now I want to turn to the $64,000 question: which is best? Of the three, I think it's clear that materialism is the dominant conception on the contemporary scene, at least among philosophers, maybe not among ordinary folk. I think this shouldn't be surprising given the prevalence of naturalism in philosophy. That is, the doctrine that everything that exists, or at least all of contingent reality, is wholly material. I think it's important to see, however, that as a theory of human personhood, materialism has a lot going for it quite independently of naturalism. In particular, it has some significant theoretical virtues. For example, it's theoretically parsimonious. It invokes only a single type of substance, and one which we're already committed to. It makes good sense of the unity of human minds with bodies, something, as we'll see, substance dualists have traditionally struggled with. In addition to these sorts of views, it also does a good job of upholding common sense views about the materiality of human persons. So, for example, it preserves our pre-theoretical conception of ourselves as bodies of a certain type, namely as organisms. And for the same reason, it can also uphold the goodness of the body and the badness of death. What's good for us is good for the body. What's bad for us is bad. What's bad for the body is bad for us. Along each of these parameters, therefore, materialism clearly has a lot going for it. It's worth emphasizing, though, that materialism is not only the dominant conception of human persons among contemporary philosophers, it's also the conception of choice for many contemporary Christian philosophers and theologians. That is, folks like Peter Van Inwagen, Lynn Rudder Baker, Hud Hudson, Trenton Merricks, and others who, like Aquinas, want to allow their conception of human persons to be shaped by their theology. Nor is it hard to see why. Christian scripture and tradition themselves seem to offer considerable support for the materiality of human persons. So, for example, here's a passage from Genesis 3. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. This strongly suggests that we're material substances or bodies, and indeed that death involves our corruption or destruction as such. And of course, there are Christian doctrines like the resurrection of the body and the incarnation of Christ, which also put great emphasis on the goodness of the human body and the badness of human death. As is also pointed out, however, especially by other Christian philosophers and theologians, despite these advantages, materialism is at a serious disadvantage when it comes to preserving common sense and traditional Christian teachings about the immateriality of persons. And I put this in red so that you'll know that this is a bad thing. This is a cause. In particular, materialism has a hard time, I think, accounting for our differences from non-human animals, especially if we take those to include something that Christians and other major monotheists have traditionally insisted on, namely that we somehow bear the image of God. If God's wholly immaterial and we're in his image, it seems like we need to be at least partly immaterial. What's more, materialism also has a hard time accounting for traditional Christian views about immortality of the soul and the afterlife. But of course, both of these things, these last two things, or I guess all three things, also enjoy considerable support from Scripture and tradition. Thus, in addition to passages like the one from Genesis I quoted a moment ago, there are also passages like this one from Ecclesiastes. When the dust returns to the ground, the spirit returns to God who gave it. And this, of course, appears to emphasize our connection to a soul that exists apart from the body. Again, they're the famous words of Christ to the thief on the cross, who asked Christ to remember him in his kingdom. In response, Christ says, I tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise. This passage is traditionally taken to refer to a time prior to the resurrection, and hence to a time when the thief will still be bodiless or disembodied. Indeed, on the traditional view of the afterlife, rewards and punishments for what we've done in this life will be distributed by God immediately after death. And here's a passage from Aquinas showing that he clearly commits himself to this traditional view. I'll just read this last little bit that's underlined. Neither the reward of the good nor the punishment of the bad is put off until the souls take up their bodies again. Obviously, materialism isn't going to be able to handle traditional Christian views of this sort. Okay, so for anyone committed to traditional Christian views about immortality and the afterlife, it might appear that we should abandon materialism in favor of something more like substance dualism. For in that case, we'll be able to make good sense of those aspects of common sense and tradition that appear to require the immateriality of human persons. So we can turn that bad color into a good one. I suspect it's precisely this sort of thought that explains why substance dualism has always been popular among Christians. Even so, substance dualism appears to have some pretty significant costs of its own. In fact, it appears to fall short along precisely those parameters that materialism succeeds. It's not theoretically parsimonious. On the contrary, it invokes two different types of substance instead of one. It effectively denies the unity of human bodies and minds, saying it amounts to nothing more than causal connection. It violates the common sense intuition that we're organisms or living bodies, and for the same reason seems to minimize both the goodness of the body and the badness of death. Of these various costs, contemporary materialists often emphasize its failure to capture our intuitions about our relationship to our bodies. So they focus on this often. Trenton Merrickx puts the point well, I think. He says, I think when you look in the mirror or down at your hands, you can see yourself. If you're an immaterial soul, that's not going to work. And when you hold your child, you do exactly that. These claims imply that we are not souls of the sort imagined by substance dualism. By contrast, Aquinas tends to emphasize substance dualism's failure to preserve the unity of minds and bodies and the badness of death. So these are the ones he picks up on, and you can see that from this passage. Plato, he says, maintained that the relationship of the soul to the body is like that of a sailor to a ship, or that of one who is clothed to his clothing. But this position can't be upheld, for if the body were related in that way, if the soul were related to the body as a sailor's in a ship, it would follow that the unity of the soul and body is accidental, and then death would be an accidental as opposed to a substantial change. Of course, all this might make us wonder whether substance dualism is really better off than materialism after all. In fact, it might make us wonder how both of these first two traditional conceptions compare to our third. Trialism hasn't received the sort of detailed analysis or attention from philosophers or theologians that materialism and substance dualism have. I think this is unfortunate, as trialism appears to have a number of things going for it as a conception of human persons. Indeed, it might appear to be the only one capable of doing justice to both the materiality and immateriality of human persons. Now, admittedly, trialism can't be regarded as theoretically parsimonious. Indeed, insofar as it appeals to three different types of substance, it's worse off in this regard than either materialism or substance dualism. What's more, it can't quite preserve the common sense intuition that we just are our bodies, that we just are organisms, but it can come close by saying that we're composed of them. In almost every other respect, however, trialism is the equal, if not the superior, of its materialistic and dualistic rivals. Thus, insofar as trialism says that we're composed of bodies, it can preserve all the other advantages of materialism, including its other theoretical virtues, the unity of minds and bodies, its account of the materiality of persons, including the goodness of the human body and the badness of death. And insofar as trialism says we're composed of immaterial souls, it can also preserve the chief advantages of substance dualism, including our differences from non-human animals and the immortality of the soul. The only place a question arises has to do with how well trialism can be said to fit with traditional Christian views of the afterlife. And in particular with that interim period of punishment and reward. This turns out to be an important question, and one that we'll have to return to since it affects the proper understanding of Aquinas' views. But before we can do that, let's first attempt to get clear about Aquinas' own conception of human persons, namely what I'll call his hylomorphism. So this brings us to part 3. Aquinas thinks of all reality in broadly Aristotelian terms, and he thinks of the material world in particular in terms of matter and form, or hule and morphe in Aristotle's Greek. It's for the same reason that he conceives of material objects in general, and human persons in particular, as hylomorphic compounds. That is, as entities that exist in virtue of some matter possessing a form. Aquinas' hylomorphic conception of human persons bears important similarities to all three of the conceptions we just considered. In the end, I don't think it can properly be interpreted in terms of any of them. Even so, if we want to make progress in understanding his conception, I think there's no better place to begin than with its connection to each of the others, beginning with its connection to, or similarities to, materialism. Like materialists, Aquinas identifies human persons with living bodies or organisms, and like them, he thinks of such bodies or organisms as a type of material substance. So Socrates is identical to a material substance. Got ahead of myself there. And what's more, Aquinas thinks of material substances or bodies as having a special connection to matter, and minds or souls as having a special connection to form. Indeed, in the case of human persons, he just identifies the human soul with the form of the body. Since it's natural to take forms to be properties, moreover, it might seem that this commits him to thinking of the relationship between the soul and body in the same way that materialists do, namely as property possession. And in light of all that, it might seem that Aquinas' hylomorphism is best understood as a type of materialism. But it turns out this can't be right. And the reasons become clear from its similarities to the second conception we looked at, substance dualism. So let's look briefly at that. Although Aquinas thinks of forms in general as properties, in the special case of the human soul, he insists that it's not a property, but an immaterial substance. There's a little complication here. It's a subsistent, but anything that subsists is a substance in the broad sense. Indeed, he thinks of it not only as a substance in the broad sense, but one which survives the death of the body and continues to support rational thought and volition in its absence. What's more, Aquinas makes it clear that he takes the human body, which is a material substance, and the human soul, which is an immaterial substance, to be the only two types of substance required to explain our nature as human beings, or human persons. And of course, all this suggests that he thinks of the relationship between the human body and soul more along the lines of substance dualis, namely as a relation between things which are causally connected. In light of all this, it might seem that Aquinas' hylomorphism is best understood as a type of substance dualism rather than materialism. But in fact, this can't be right either, for reasons that become clear from its similarities to trialism. As we've seen, substance dualists identify persons with their souls, and hence take them to be wholly immaterial beings. As we've also seen, however, Aquinas rejects this identification, insisting instead that human persons must be identified with their bodies, and so themselves must be conceived of as material substances. What's more, Aquinas insists that human persons are not only distinct from their souls, but possess them in the way a whole possesses its parts. But this in turn requires that human persons are at least partly immaterial beings for him. Indeed, as Aquinas sees it, human beings are partly material and partly immaterial, composed of both matter and form, or body and soul. It might be wondered why Aquinas describes human beings as material substances, given that they're composed at least partly of immaterial souls, and of an immaterial substance or soul. The answer is that as he's using the term, something qualifies as material just in case it possesses matter. This is precisely what distinguishes human persons, as well as all other creatures in the material world, from God and the angels, who are wholly immaterial. Even so, since Aquinas thinks of human persons as unique in possessing both material and immaterial parts, it would be better, I think, to characterize them as complex substances, as the trialists do. Indeed, I think, as we can now see, Aquinas conceives of the relationship between the matter and form of a human person in the same way that trialists conceive of the relation between the human body and soul, namely as a relation that holds between distinct things that are substantially united to each other and jointly compose a human person. In light of all this, it might seem that in the final analysis, Aquinas' hylomorphism is best understood as a form of trialism. But in fact, even this can't be quite right, and we can see that, I think, if we briefly consider its differences from all three conceptions. Okay. As already noted, Aquinas does speak as if human persons are composed of bodies. And this could be taken to suggest that the matter, as opposed to the form of a human person, is itself a material substance, indeed a third type of substance in addition to the other two. But when Aquinas is being most careful, what he says is that human beings are identical to their bodies and composed of prime matter, where such matter is to be understood not as another type of substance, but rather as a kind of non-individual stuff incapable of existing on its own. In the end, therefore, I think that Aquinas' hylomorphic conception of human persons must be understood in a way that distinguishes it from all the other conceptions we've considered, and I've tried to indicate this with those 5 claims at F on the handout. There are exactly 2 types of substance required to explain our nature as humans: material substances, immaterial substances. Our bodies are material substances. Our souls are wholly immaterial. Excuse me, I should say our bodies are partly material substances. Our minds or souls are wholly immaterial substances. We're identical to our bodies, and we possess minds or souls as well as matter or non-individual stuff as parts. And so in the end, we're partly material and partly immaterial beings. In short, I think it's clear that Aquinas' hylomorphism does provide us with a distinct conception of human persons, one which for the same reasons, as I'll now try to explain, is both historically and philosophically significant. The characterization of Aquinas' hylomorphism just given, I think, is historically significant insofar as it provides us with a novel interpretation of his views. Philosophers have often wondered about how best to characterize Aquinas' conception of human persons. And I think it's fair to say that their dispute, at least in the contemporary literature, has focused on the question of whether we should think of him as a substance dualist or not. So non-historians tend to lump him together with the substance dualist because of his views about the immortality of the soul. I hope I said non-historians do that. Historians, by contrast, and especially Thomistic commentators, have typically taken the opposite view, insisting that whatever Aquinas is, he is not a substance dualist. And this has to do with the fact that he denies so explicitly that human beings are their souls. So, in fact, what historians usually suggest is that Aquinas' view lie on the cusp between these two. It carves out an interesting sort of middle ground. If my interpretation is right, however, both parties go wrong in thinking of Aquinas' hylomorphism solely in terms of its connection to materialism and substance dualism. I agree with both parties in thinking that Aquinas' views can't be understood in terms of materialism, and I agree with the historians against the non-historians in thinking that they can't be understood in terms of substance dualism. Though to be fair to the non-historians, they often use the term dualism in an exceedingly broad sense. Even so, the point is just this. If Aquinas' views are going to be located anywhere on here, I think they're best located on the cusp between substance dualism and trialism rather than down there at the beginning. Okay, as these remarks are intended to show, Aquinas' hylomorphism is not only historically significant, but also philosophically significant, marking out a distinctive position whose possibility has been almost entirely overlooked in the contemporary context. For the sake of clarity, I've included a table at G on the handout highlighting the precise relationship of hylomorphism to these other 3 conceptions. There's actually supposed to be some shading there. The shading indicates similarities. Its absence indicates differences. But here it looks like there are no similarities by that criterion. In any case, here's the upshot. The table is supposed to help us see that Aquinas' hylomorphism shares important similarities with each of those conceptions despite being distinct from each. It shares the most in common with trialism, including its account of both the nature of human persons and their relationship to their souls. It shares the next most in common with substance dualism, including the number of different types of substance it appeals to in accounting for human persons. And it shares just one important thing in common with materialism, namely the identification of human persons with their bodies. Though even here, hylomorphism departs to a certain extent from materialism in thinking of human bodies as only partly material. The distinctive nature of Aquinas' hylomorphism gives it, I think, some distinctive advantages as a conception of human persons, at least along the parameters we've been considering. And here I would refer you to the table at H on the handout, which will remind you of these parameters, and also show you how the various conceptions fare relative to each. You can ignore, I was going to say the shaded row, but it doesn't look shaded. You could ignore the row that includes the third desideratum, the stuff about collocation. I'm going to ignore that. Given what I said earlier about trialism's advantages as a conception of human person, I think it's especially significant that Aquinas' hylomorphism shares all of its advantages, all the same advantages, but none of its distinctive costs. Note that Aquinas' hylomorphism also does better, at least in terms of sheer number of advantages, than either materialism or substance dualism. There can be no doubt that hylomorphism is worse off than materialism when it comes to theoretical parsimony. But really, that's the only respect in which it's worse off. And in any case, materialism won't be a live option for anyone committed to upholding the immortality of the soul, much less the immateriality of human persons. This suggests that at least when it comes to the parameters we've been considering, the real choice is between hylomorphism and substance dualism. But even here, hylomorphism might appear to be the clear victor, since only it can do justice both to the materiality and the immateriality of human persons. So the question arises, should we just conclude that hylomorphism is the overall conception of human persons? Not quite. As I noted earlier, there's still a question about how well hylomorphism fares relative to substance dualism when it comes to the afterlife. Before we can make any final decisions, therefore, about the overall victor or the overall winner of this title, we must first address this final question head on. So let's briefly have a look at that, and this brings us to the final section, Aquinas on human death. Death, as we've been thinking of it, is just the separation of the soul from the body. Insofar as Aquinas accepts the immortality of the soul, he's obviously committed to saying that the soul survives this separation. But what about the whole human person? When Socrates' soul separates from his matter, does Socrates himself survive? This question turns out to be a difficult one to answer for Aquinas, since to my knowledge he never explicitly addresses it. Even so, we can distinguish two different models of human death corresponding to the two different possible answers he could give to the question. Both models will obviously presuppose his hylomorphism, so consider again that Socrates is a complex substance for Aquinas composed of both matter and soul. Moreover, let's begin by considering Socrates at some point prior to his death. And for good measure, let's also consider a time after which he will be resurrected. Okay, so here's the first model, Model 1. According to this model, which I'll refer to as cessationism, when human persons die, they utterly cease to exist. Thus, when Socrates dies, say as a result of drinking the hemlock, and his soul separates from his matter, Socrates himself goes out of existence, only to return at the general resurrection of the dead, when a separated soul is reunited with matter. So here's the idea. Socrates drinks the hemlock, he's laying on the floor, now he's gone, only to return at the general resurrection. Model number 2. By contrast, according to the second model, which I'll refer to as survivalism, human persons survive their death along with their separated rational souls. Thus, what goes out of existence when Socrates' soul separates from his matter is not Socrates, but his body. And likewise, what returns at the general resurrection of the dead when his separated soul is reunited with matter is not Socrates, he's been there all along, but only Socrates' body. I've given you definitions of these two models as well as a sort of snapshot illustration of them on your handout at I, and then a few things later, L, where you get the whole page. But assuming the basic distinction between the two models is clear, the $64,000 question once again is, which of these models is best? I think it's fair to say that Aquinas' commentators nowadays typically interpret his hylomorphism in terms of the cessationist model of human death. In Indeed, cessationism is often referred to in the secondary literature as the standard interpretation. Nor is it hard to see why. It appears to be straightforwardly entailed by what Aquinas says about the materiality of human persons, and even more specifically about our nature as bodies and the badness of death. And here's why. Insofar as we just are our bodies, it would seem that we must go out of existence when we die. For Aquinas thinks it's clear that our bodies cease to exist at death. Again, in order to explain the badness of death, Aquinas says we must think of death as a substantial change. Death, as he seems to be putting it, is not like stepping off a ship or changing your clothes. In fact, it's not an accidental change of any sort. It's a substantial change or corruption, and it's hard to see how you can understand that, how a human person could undergo that if they didn't cease to exist. Despite these two pieces of evidence in its favor, cessationism has some pretty serious costs, I think, both as an interpretation of Aquinas and as a model of human death in its own right. And here I'm thinking in particular about what it implies about the afterlife, which is, of course, connected with the immateriality of human persons. And there are really two problems here, what I'll call the problem of postmortem thinking and willing, and the problem of postmortem reward and punishment. Aquinas is emphatic that when my soul is in the body, it's not my soul that thinks or wills, but only the whole human person, me. But what about after death, when my soul continues to support thought and volition, but I'm not there to have any thoughts or to do any thinking or willing? Evidently, if cessationism is true, my soul must begin doing something it's never done prior to that point, namely thinking and willing on its own. And evidently, my soul must also leave off doing that again once I'm resurrected, since then I'll be there to do it. This is made all the more strange. So I guess I should add, that's strange. This is made all the more strange by the fact that cessationists themselves admit, because Aquinas is perfectly explicit about this, that the soul is not a person. But how can anything other than a person even think? So how can it even begin to do this thing it's never done? Okay, that's the first problem. The second problem is a problem about reward and punishment. We've seen that Aquinas thinks immediately following death someone or something is rewarded or punished for the deeds I performed in this life, but if cessationism is true, it can't be me, since I won't be around. Hence it must be my soul, since it appears to be the only candidate left. But here again, this is a very strange consequence, especially again if we add that the soul isn't a person. To be fair, at least some of Aquinas' interpreters are aware of these problems and have come up with some ingenious suggestions for reconciling cessationism both with Aquinas' texts and with traditional Christian teachings about the afterlife. Even so, the problems with this model of human death seem to me significant enough to warrant a closer look at our second model, survivalism. Survivalism has the advantages of avoiding precisely the problems that plague cessationism. According to the survivalists, I survive my death, so there's no question about who does my thinking or willing after death. I do. Nor is there any question about who is punished or rewarded for my deeds in life. I am. The problem for survivalism, however, is how to reconcile it with the very considerations that motivate cessationism in the first place. In particular, with what Aquinas' hylomorphism says about the materiality of human persons. After all, how could we survive our death if we just are our bodies, but they don't survive? Or how could we survive it if death requires us to undergo a substantial change? As it turns out, we get answers to both of these questions, I think, if we consider them in light of certain things Aquinas says about the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. So I want to just very briefly consider a few things that he says about this doctrine. According to official statements, God was in Christ reconciling himself to the world. That, in a nutshell, is the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. What's important for our purposes, however, is more specifically the view that at a specific point in time and in the person of Christ, God took on human nature, thereby becoming fully human without ceasing to be fully divine, lived out a perfectly sinless life, eventually suffered and died, but on the third day was resurrected from the dead. Obviously, this is a complicated doctrine, but I want to focus merely on Aquinas' understanding of what was involved when Christ became human, died, and was resurrected, and beginning with the became human part. So let's look at each of these things. In line with the tradition going back at least to the 5th century, with the Council of Chalcedon, Aquinas takes the doctrine of the Incarnation to imply that when Christ became human, he did so by taking on a human body and soul. Or more precisely for Aquinas, he took on matter and a soul, and thereby became a body. Okay, but what about when he died? Here again, in line with tradition, he assumes that Christ ceased to be embodied, but not ensouled. Indeed, as Aquinas sees it, during the 3 days of his death, Christ ceased to be a body, and he did so precisely because he ceased to be composed of matter. What's more, when he was resurrected or became a body again, that was precisely because he came to be composed of matter again. As even these brief remarks suggest, Aquinas is thinking of the incarnation and Christ's death in particular along the lines of survivalism. Christ is God. So here's the little timeline for Christ. Christ is God, so obviously when he dies, he doesn't cease to exist altogether. That would be impossible. On the contrary, he merely ceases to be a material substance or body, that is, a substance composed of matter. Even so, he clearly undergoes a substantial change when he dies, for he ceases to be partly material substance and instead becomes a wholly immaterial one. That is to say, he changes from being one type of substance to another. That's the point of its being a substantial change. And of course, something similar happens when he's resurrected. He becomes a partly material substance again. This survivalist model of the incarnation gives us, I think, all we need to solve our initial problem about how to reconcile survivalism with what hylomorphism says about the materiality of human persons. Christ just is his body, but his body ceases to exist even though he doesn't. So why couldn't the same be true of us? Likewise, Christ undergoing a substantial change at death doesn't require him to cease to exist, so why should it be any different for us? There is, however, one remaining problem. On Aquinas' hylomorphism, it belongs to our nature to be material. In fact, Aquinas says as much in various places. But if that's true, it's hard to see how we could be material at one time and immaterial at another, as the survivalist model seems to require. Indeed, it might be thought that it's only because Christ is divine rather than human by nature that he can be material at one time and immaterial at another, and hence that the survivalist model applies to him. The problem here, though, I think, is more terminological than anything else. Aquinas does say at various places that it belongs to our nature, or even belongs to the essence of human persons to be material, but he also makes the same sorts of claims about the human soul, even though he thinks it's clear that the soul can exist apart from the body. So here's the problem, but here's what you might think of it as would be a similar problem in the case of the soul. The soul is naturally united to a body since it belongs to the nature to be the form of the body. And yet, as he goes on to make clear, this isn't supposed to be inconsistent with the fact that the soul can exist without any matter or any body. As passages like this one make clear, then, to say that it belongs to the nature or essence of the soul to be in the body just means that the soul is essentially disposed to be in the body, or that it's contrary to its natural state to be separated from it. I think we should interpret Aquinas' claims about the essential connection between human persons and their matter or bodies in the same way. And if we do, then survivalism will not even be in conflict with what hylomorphism requires about our being material. Okay, it's time to bring this talk to a close. Let's then briefly consider what we can conclude at this point. So first, with regard to survivalism versus cessationism, I think it's clear that survivalism provides us with a better hylomorphic model of human death than cessationism. There's nothing to prevent us from interpreting Aquinas' hylomorphism in terms of survivalism. On the contrary, there's both positive textual and philosophical grounds for doing so. What's more, if we do interpret his views in this way, we can avoid all those knotty problems having to do with the afterlife, the soul's thinking and willing, being punished and rewarded on our behalf, and so on. And that seems like a good thing, both in itself and for what it tells us about hylomorphism versus substance dualism. Remember, we had this question about how hylomorphism fares relative to substance dualism when it comes to the afterlife. But if what I've said is correct, the answer should be clear. Hylomorphism fares just as well as substance dualism with respect to the afterlife, at least when interpreted along survivalist lines. But then doesn't it just follow that hylomorphism, so interpreted, provides the best overall conception of human persons, at least along the parameters we've been considering? Again, I'm sad to say, not quite. For it must be recognized that the survivalist interpretation of hylomorphism does bring with it an important cost, namely the requirement that a complex object, namely a human person, can be composed, at least temporarily, of just a single part, namely its soul. This is a strange consequence, to say the least. Indeed, one might even think it's an incoherent one, for if an object is complex, that is to say, if it has parts at all, it might appear to be impossible for it to have just one. It seems like to have parts is to have many parts. At this point, however, I think we've got to be careful. Aquinas can allow that it's impossible for an object to be composed of a single part throughout its entire career. His view doesn't require that. What it requires is that an object that starts off having multiple parts can come temporarily to be composed of just one of them. And that, I submit, is not incoherent. Strange? Yes. Surprising? Definitely. But not impossible. In fact, you might just think it's something surprising and interesting we learn from the Incarnation, since traditional understanding of it seems to imply that Christ was temporarily composed of a single part. I realize, of course, that not everyone will share my enthusiasm for the survivalist model of human death, or even for the type of hylomorphism that underlies it. In fact, I can easily imagine that reflection on the very same considerations that lead me to embrace both things might well tip the balance for someone else in favor of another conception, or perhaps even cessationism. I do, however, hope at least to have convinced you of the significance of Aquinas' views on the topic of human personhood and death, as well as the value and interest that can come from approaching this topic from the perspective of his broadly Aristotelian Christian hylomorphism. If my interpretation is correct, his views seem to mark out a number of positions that have yet to receive the attention they deserve, as well as to identify a host of considerations that must be evaluated if we are to arrive at the truth about our nature and destiny.